Hello again. I'm Josh Eccles. I'm CTO here at LabKey, and delighted to have a chance to share some information and insights into NIH's data management and sharing policy, a relatively new requirement, and try and keep it short, kind of talk through the basics, and then leave some time for Q&A. Saw some questions about recording. Yes, we are recording this. We'll get it posted and shared to everyone who registered, so you can share it with other folks offline as well. Please go ahead and submit questions and comments in the chat or the Q&A tool here in Zoom. I'll most likely wait till the end to cover most of the questions, but happy to stay and get through all of them. So thanks again for joining. Lots of people I recognize on the attendee list. Hello. And for those who I don't recognize, here's a quick overview of LabKey and why we're very involved in data management and sharing policy type things. We've been around over 20 years at this point. We started really as a proteomics data management analysis system, spun off from Fred Hutchinson in Seattle, and really have kind of grown into a bunch of different scientific realms, really focused in life sciences. And more recently have been focused on things, really kind of built for purpose products, LabKey Sample Manager, LabKey Antibody Discovery, LIMS, and kind of a full suite of products really around data management and analysis. We've got a lot of different organizations using LabKey solutions in different capacities across the globe. And here are a few. You'll probably recognize many of them. And now on to the data management and sharing policy itself. So I assume most people are here because they have an upcoming grant. And I'll do a little poll here in Zoom. Curious kind of where people are in the process, and either a new grant or maybe a renewal cycle. But basically, as of a little over a year ago, NIH instituted this new policy requiring that new or renewal applications for funding include a DMS, as they call it, plan as part of the application process. And then there's also requirements to comply with that plan. So it's not just saying what you're going to do, it's following through and delivering on the elements of the plan. And really, this applies to people who get money from NIH. So there's, of course, plenty of different funding mechanisms, grant types, SBIR, STTR, et cetera. And they're all included under this umbrella. Really, it's if you're generating scientific data, you will need to comply with this policy. Fortunately, it's really not all that onerous. It's more kind of talking about, here is my plan. I'll get into the elements that need to be included in that plan shortly. And there's actually quite a few good resources from NIH themselves to help people prepare that and submit. So scientific data, I think everyone has a reasonable handle on what that means. NIH has the definition here, but I don't find it especially of note. Maybe the interesting thing to call out is it is not just data that is supporting a publication. Other types of scientific data generated for research findings of any kind are also subject to this. And there are requirements as well on the length of time that you need to maintain that data. By default, they assume it's a 3-year period. But do read the fine print carefully on the grant or contract you're applying for, because it may specify different time periods. And they understand that there's other policies as well that you may need to comply to just from your own organization, or maybe research consortia or other types of affiliations. It is not intended to include everything that you do every day. It's not covering the Post-it notes that you're generating as you scratch down ideas. It's not covering preliminary analyses. It's not covering kind of the peer review feedback cycle, kind of plans or brainstorming for future projects. It's not capturing your emails with your collaborators or the physical objects. It's really the data. Think of it as the files on your computer or similar types of cloud-based resources that are capturing your research findings themselves. And that goes through the raw data to the analysis results. And so there can be many different types of data that are covered here, but it's not that kind of work in progress, things that you've tried and discarded or kind of moved on to other approaches. In general, you're not going to be able to get out of sharing data in almost all cases. So they have a handful of reasons that they'd consider exempting data and findings from being included in the scope. Typically it's around kind of privacy or safety of human participants in a clinical trial or other study, and especially when there's no way to effectively anonymize that data. Of course, anything else that you're bound by law to not disclose won't be covered here. And you may have other agreements in place with other entities that could be used as a justification for limiting the scope of data sharing. But in general, they're not going to say, oh, you don't know where to put this data in the end. You need to find a place, and I'll talk a little bit more about repositories where this data can end up at the end of the research process. And you certainly can't justify it by saying, I don't think other people are going to be interested in this, so I'm not going to share. They're assuming if they're finding it, it is hopefully of interest to more than just you. So with that, I'll share the results of that first poll and move on to a little bit more of the structure of the plan. Fortunately, it's pretty short. The target length that they state is 2 pages, and a good amount of that is covered by kind of the boilerplate, the template itself. So in general, in the examples that they've shared, there's I forgot, maybe 20 or 30 different example submissions that NIH has made available on their website. They're using a few sentences, maybe a couple of paragraphs to respond to these prompts. So it's not excruciating detail. It's really kind of, here's my high level idea for how I'm going to generate this data. I'm going to analyze this data. I'm going to manage this data, and then where that data is going to end up as the sharing point to the outside world. I do find it amusing that they say that the target length is 2 pages, and almost every single one of their examples is 3 or 4 pages long, but still relatively short, thank goodness. They're pretty open on the format, but I don't see any reason why you would deviate significantly from this template that they provided. Kind of 12 different prompts or sections, and I'll talk through those in a moment. And they estimate it should take 2 hours to complete this. I assume it'll probably take longer in practice, just with back and forth and making sure you've captured the right elements, but pretty light lift compared to all of the other things that go into a grant or contract application. And there are resources out there. Many repositories that you might be depositing your data into will have a paragraph, kind of a blurb that you can paste in to describe where you're going to deposit the data and why that's a trustworthy kind of spot with longevity that's going to maintain your data. So please look for those kind of pre-built responses to some of these questions before you draft your own, especially when you're citing some widely used resource, whether it's a software tool for analysis or a data repository. So these are the different sections. You can see some of them in the screenshot of that template, kind of the different elements that you are meant to respond to as part of your overall plan submission. Zoom window here momentarily. And so data type. So what types of data are you going to be generating as part of your research? And this is an area where I think it's really kind of a high-level, hand-wavy type of response, because you're not going to submit your entire methods section from the multiple publications you're generating out of this research. But you kind of the quick summary, kind of the scope, maybe the number of samples anticipated, the number of different analyses that you plan to do on those, and talking about are there any of those ethical, legal, technical factors that might play into what is appropriate to share or not, based on the requirements I outlined a few slides ago. And then also thinking about the metadata that you are going to be capturing, really to facilitate your own research, but then making that available to others as part of the sharing process at the tail end of the research. And this, I think is kind of an evergreen area for people to really debate on, are other people doing enough to curate their metadata so that it can be sufficiently leveraged? And so I think this is really a chance to talk to your emphasis on making this data actually useful to others, and having enough context to make it reusable and a valuable resource to the community, and therefore worthy of funding. This is a little more kind of the technical section of the plan, looking at what sorts of tools or software or programs you plan to use to analyze and make sense of that data. It is not a problem to be using commercial tools. I think they have a preference for open source or freely available tools, but there's no problem in using commercial software. You just need to cite it, and if you are planning to create your own analysis tools, let's say you're scripting in Python or R or anything like that, how you plan to share those scripts. If it's a GitHub repository or something like that, this would be a great place to share that plan. The standard side, kind of what format will all of this data be captured in and analyzed in? Hopefully there's kind of standard file formats or things like that that you can just quickly reference and that reviewers of the plan will already be familiar with. The data preservation and kind of the timelines for when data will be made available, how long it will be available, and to whom. So this is really citing the specific repositories, and hopefully, again, these are resources that you're largely familiar with already. Maybe you deposited data there from previous projects. Maybe you go there as a place to find resources already. If you're, the repositories themselves tend to have their own search tools and metadata context, and assigning unique identifiers when things are initially uploaded and things like that. So hopefully the repository can speak to most of that with the blurb that you can just drop in to your response here. And then when will that data be made available is very important, because that's a commitment that you're making and need to follow through on as you go throughout your research project. I think in general, it's ideal to not wait until, say, the last day of the funding cycle to deposit everything all at once. That tends to be rushed and unpleasant for everyone. But kind of what's your schedule for phasing in the deposition of this data into the repositories. The reuse considerations are sometimes where some of the legal implications come in terms of informed consent. You have people who are participated in the research, given their consent for their data to be used in these other contexts. Oftentimes it's scoped very narrowly based on IRB approval. And so that may prevent reuse in certain cases, and perhaps even prevent the sharing of the data in the first place. So that would need to be spoken to. And in general, they're looking for anything that limits the extent of the data sharing. And certainly the general vibe is it's not appropriate to say, I don't want to share my data because I plan to publish additional results on it after the fact. That is not likely to be seen as a valid reason to hold back any of the data. And this, I believe, this is the last piece, the oversight. How are you going to hold yourself accountable to following through on the commitments you make in the DMS plan in terms of what data is being shared, by whom, at what time points, and with what metadata or other context. And so this is really expectations for how you within your own organization, within your own lab, or maybe in conjunction with compliance organization in your university or other institution that can help make sure that you follow through on what you set out to do. Good news is NIH is willing to fund these activities. They understand that they take time, they take money, and so they break out the allowable costs, which I think are pretty consistent with their guidelines for other types of resources and activities. Basically anything that's touching the data, whether it's curating or analyzing it or de-identifying it, documenting it, so attaching metadata so that people are more likely to find it and be able to reuse it. Local data management solutions, being able to keep track of that data in your lab, and this is of course an area that LabKey has significant expertise in. You can get funding for those sorts of tools and platforms. Fees for depositing into a repository. Different repositories have effectively different business models for how they fund themselves. And one thing that's helpful to note is all costs must be incurred during the performance period. So even though there's a retention policy that default 3 years, sometimes longer, that this data needs to be made available, all the costs need to be incurred during the actual performance period. You capture these in the budget with breaking them down into different cost categories, justification, much like any other thing that you might be asking for a line item funding in the application. So I'm thinking through how do you kind of comply not just with the letter of the requirements here, but also kind of the spirit of them. It's kind of this next phase of the presentation. So really, this is aiming towards using the data consistently and accurately. It's no help to anyone to share data or even just have data internal to an organization if it's not going to produce meaningful results. So carefully storing, preserving, documenting the data. If you have turnover in your lab, it is oftentimes difficult to have a new person in the lab pick up and make sense of what the previous person did, much less when it's a completely separate organization trying to find and make use of this data. So FAIR, I assume pretty much everyone here has probably heard of that. Definable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data principles is definitely very aligned with the spirit of this new policy. Ways that the LabKey works with groups on this, we've got expertise not just in the software side, but kind of in general best practices for data management throughout the research process. And we have a lot of our own tools, and we know a lot of other third-party tools with support and recommendations for best use of those as well. Metadata is a real sticking point, as I alluded to earlier. Having enough context to know, right, this raw file that came off an instrument, for example, what sample did it come from? What happened to that sample? Where was that sample acquired? What were the phenotypic characteristics of the the person, the animal, the culture that it was captured from. This is a lot of work and really vital, not only for sharing the data, but for just proper use, interpretation, analysis of all the data within your own research activities. LabKey captures a lot of metadata about a lot of different types of primary data and stitches them together in a way that lets you query and say, okay, for this assay result, it came from this sample, which was derived from this other sample, and so forth, tracking that whole lineage with metadata associated with every step in that chain. And whenever possible, using either standardized or custom, if there is no appropriate standard, ontology, or even just having simple drop-down lists instead of having people freeform type in a variety of creative interpretation or abbreviations or capitalizations or other things that just really get in the way of consistent metadata and data capture more generally. Naming conventions are really important. It may not rise to the level of things that you're summarizing in your plan itself, but these things really make it more consistent, more predictable, and findable when things are well aligned across different file names or sample IDs or anything along those lines. So LabKey can do validation of those to make sure that any identifier is following that naming convention as prescribed. It can take activities, kick off an analysis pipeline, or import data based on file names and other conventions. Knowing that if a file name ends with QC, for example, that it's routed to a different location where you're doing monitoring of your instrument performance as opposed to your primary experimental assay. And it can also assign identifiers for things like samples or subjects to have a consistent pattern and kind of a full catalog of the named entities. Common data elements are things that kind of stitch together research across different projects. So being able to say, right, we took maybe a common mouse line, and that was the source of the sample, and being able to kind of integrate across these different kinds of resources, across these different sources of material or other data, and also connecting to other systems that you might be capturing data in, like RedCap or OpenEMPI or just general relational databases. Is really important to be able to integrate across different data elements from different sources. Data storage and formats, touched on this a bit earlier, that spreadsheets, of course, are very general purpose. They're also very open to problems because they are so general purpose and not built for purpose. So being able to take data in a spreadsheet, capture it in a more structured way, being able to validate that, being able to import other file formats, maybe the output of an instrument in its raw file format or other things like that, and then being able to consistently analyze that data and keep track of different versions of analyses and track the lineage, not just of the physical samples, but also the downstream data analysis is really important. So with that, I'll launch our second poll, kind of asking, how are folks feeling? Do they feel like they have tools in place already, and it's more a matter of documenting them, or is this also an opportunity to grab new tools and adopt new best practices? Here's kind of part of our product offering suite from the sample manager side, kind of just tracking samples and freezer, and then building on assay, integration with other third-party systems like RedCap, for example. There's a whole suite, so we'd be happy to talk about any of those to help meet your needs. And then this is the last element, the data repository side. So kind of after you've done all of your in-house analysis and created your research findings, putting in a place where other people can discover it and use it. So really, the guidance is use an existing repository. Don't try to make your own. And find one that's appropriate for the primary data that you are generating. Like I said, you're probably familiar with most of these already. There are some general purpose repositories. Think of them more as just a Dropbox or something like that, where you can upload files that don't have a more specialized repository that comes to mind for them. NIH, like almost every element of this data plan, NIH isn't endorsing specific repositories. They do have a pretty extensive list of ones that they think are good resources. You may need to split across multiple depending on what types of data you're generating. And you just think, where do you look for data like this already? Odds are that's a place that you can deposit. Well, again, we don't encourage most groups to try and create a repository. We have worked with a bunch of different organizations to create things that actually fit as repositories for things that have a strong affiliation with LabKey already. Some of them are very interactive, which is great. The trial share and immune space are good examples, letting you kind of do kind of additional analyses in place instead of just being a spot to download files and then do your own offline analysis. But again, you're probably familiar with a good spot to drop these things. So wrapping up, key takeaways are this applies to all NIH funding applications going forward. And really it's having a plan, documenting that plan, following that plan. It's a relatively short submission, 2, 3, 4 pages, and LabKey would be happy to help. If you feel like you could increase your data management tools in-house. So with that, we'll go ahead and look through questions. Looks like some folks have submitted. Thank you. I've got both chat and Q&As. So yes, recording will be shared as I mentioned before, and we'll send that out as a follow-up to everyone who registered. Question is whether there is a policy for sharing data obtained with research participants. Some participants would like images or potential clinical phenotype data sent to the primary care provider. So I think that's really outside the scope of this policy. I don't think there's anything in the policy that conflicts with doing that in any way, but the policy is really about making your research data public, not sharing, say, individual patient results. So that would be kind of totally separate, and I don't think even needs to be probably mentioned in your application, unless, of course, there's obligations that those not be made public for PHI or other reasons. That's what I would focus on in the DMS plan response. What should we add to the DMS in case we are running a proposal about analysis and software developed using data already existing and collected? Should we say that no data will be generated in the proposal? So there I'd say that, basically cite the data that you're planning to use as your inputs into your research process. And so, you're not collecting new specimens or generating new primary data. But the analysis results would still be subject to this sharing policy. So I would think of it as just kind of the downstream. Okay, here's the types of software and tools we're planning to use for our analysis, and here's where we're going to deposit our outputs. Not the. I don't think there would be a need to reshare the original inputs. You can just cite where they are already and you're pulling from. So let's see some questions about I think LabKey's offerings itself, about pricing and data types. So there's really a wide variety of offerings, starting with Sample Manager, kind of our easiest to adopt and quickest to get up and running. And we have per user pricing on that. So be very happy to follow up with folks, kind of get a little better sense of where their needs are and kind of the scope of the effort involved. Generally, we do kind of annual subscription based pricing. Happy to do multi-year deals, and I think that would be a good fit for including an application like this, where you've got the period of performance, and then perhaps also covering the retention period as well. LabKey can handle a wide variety of different data formats, starting with the kind of simplest of being direct entry into a web-based form into the LabKey product, and then going up to importing spreadsheets or TSVs, a very general purpose and popular format, connecting to external systems via ETLs or other kind of database or API level connections. And then we also support a wide variety of specialized data formats for, let's say, mass spectrometry or flow cytometry or plate-based assays, all of those sorts of things. So it's pretty wide and disparate set of data that LabKey can ingest and then help integrate and analyze. So again, happy to connect with anyone as follow-up to kind of explore what's most relevant for your usage scenarios. And then a question that I don't think I know the answer to, unfortunately. Am I correct that it isn't applicable to conference grants? I guess I'm not familiar personally with a conference grant and how that's different from kind of most of the other grants in the NIH portfolio. So sorry, I don't have information there. I think that, one more question here. Do we know of past DMS submissions that have already been submitted for other grants publicly available to reference as examples? So I haven't found great resources in that direction. Mostly what I have been referring to is the list of examples that NIH has provided. And if you go to their website, the data management and sharing policy website, you'll find there's somewhere in the vicinity of 20 or 30 examples, some of them pretty general purpose, some of them tied to an individual institute. So it's more likely to maybe align with the types of data that you're generating or the types of repositories that would be relevant. So that's really what I've been kind of leaning most heavily on for kind of reference points, as well as the kind of snippets that different repositories or software tools are posting, to be kind of a copy paste to get it into your submission. Another question coming in, following up on data already existing. This may be private data provided by a company for the scope of this research that cannot be publicly shared. So I think if that's the case, that might fall under the exemption that I mentioned of, basically if there's an existing contractual agreement or other requirement on that data, that it not be shareable. That was one of the kind of 4 or 5 bullet points of the possible exceptions. So I expect that would align there. What I don't know is then how much NIH is willing to say, downstream analyses from that. How far removed does the data need to be from that original source data to be kind of covered by or not covered by that other agreement or licensing requirement or whatever the restriction is. So I think that is, what I would speak to in the DMS response would be, right, we're using this data. It's not publicly available. It's bound by this agreement, license, contractual obligation, et cetera. I also think, contacting a program officer or similar at NIH can help, give additional clarity on, exactly how to capture that. And then in terms of kind of results sharing versus the kind of algorithms used, I think that if there are proprietary algorithms that are used, that's okay to cite. Like I said, it's totally fine to use commercial software or other proprietary tools. It's just a matter of saying that is what you plan to use. And maybe giving a little context of what the restrictions are for it. I think that takes me through all of the questions that got submitted. Thank you so much for making it a little interactive. Hopefully I covered what you were hoping to learn, both in the primary presentation and in the Q&A. Thanks also for participating in the polls. We will get this recording posted before long and sent out to you. Thanks for logging in, and please let us know at LabKey if we can help you with any of these aspects.